Okay, welcome back from our brief break. I'm Ed Gulick and with High Plains Architects here in Billings. I even have, there's our logo. Oops, left in there. So before we get into some specifics in the future of renewable energy, I was going to just give a little more context for discussion on this and kind of bring it home to some of our experience here at Northern Plains. And so just a little discussion here. So photovoltaic prices have been dropping quite a bit. So when we completed the Home on the Range building, our price per panel or installed watt was quite a bit more than it is today, considerably more. So we're seeing solar prices drop. If we look at other forms of renewables, they are very, very cost competitive and actually outcompete new fossil fuels and are very competitive with existing fossil fuel generation sources that are in their midlife. So we see, for instance, though, there's quite a range with solar photovoltaics. When you have utility scale, these kinds of systems are very cost competitive on a dollars per megawatt hour basis. Along with wind, they are outcompeting methane, natural gas in its combined cycle. You can see though with photovoltaics, when you get to community solar, that drops off somewhat more. Just there is a economies of scale when you have very large installations, and so then when you get to large, like big box stores with rooftop solar, fairly big range there, and then on residential roofs, it's not as cost competitive. Compare that also with some other sources that we like a geothermal. This is a utility used for generating electricity, as well as solar thermal with melting molten salts and things with storage. These are all technologies that I think Carl is more familiar with, and I'll introduce Carl in a bit. But this is information that Lazard, which is a financial asset management company, has been assembling, and they give direction to investors. And right now, renewables are beating the more fossil fuel-based sources of power generation. But if we look at where we're at as a country right now, in terms of our total generation, this is a graph I put into Excel spreadsheet, information from the Energy Information Administration, and we see over the last 10 years the total amount of power generation, and we see coal and natural gas and nuclear and hydro and wind and geothermal and solar are the different generating sources there. And solar has a couple of them. One is the orange line is the utility solar, and the yellow line is the decentralized type, the people's own rooftop solar. So just a couple of takeaways. Renewables are still only about 20% of the total power generation mix. Total power generation is fairly flat despite population growth. So that's a good thing. We know that there's huge opportunities for energy efficiency to reduce it, but our country has been growing, and the total generation has been pretty flat. So that's the integration probably of things like LED lighting, of flat screen monitors on our computers, and just kind of a variety of lots of different technologies. We still have not seen a really systematic, methodical approach to energy efficiency that anywhere approaches its potential in this country. There's a few, utilities that are definitely doing better than others, but it's not even coming close to what the potential is for that. We've seen, of course, the descent of coal, and I had an earlier version of this chart when unfortunately it somehow has disappeared, but went back to 2006, and that's when you really start to see the precipitous drop of coal. And we see also that methane gas has increased kind of correspondingly. Nuclear kind of remains fairly steady. We're going to probably see some more drop off of that because utilities are recognizing, they already known how that is about the most expensive form of power generation we have. Wind has been climbing while hydro has declined a bit. That's maybe a little bit, it depends on the year. We have the year we started here, 2011 was a very big year for hydro. We've got dams that are silting up. We might be seeing, and plus we've got with climate change flows, the years like this year that we just see less hydro. The solar is climbing quite rapidly on a kind of percentage year-over-year basis, but it's still a pretty small piece. So that's a little bit sobering to see kind of where we're at as a country at the moment. And so where we need to be going in the next 10 years is we need to have all of the renewables going up something like this, and we need to have our total power generation going down like that through efficiencies, or some combination there. And maybe we have to increase our renewables even more rapidly because we are electrifying our buildings and we are and our transportation systems as well. So, but we need to be moving much more rapidly in certain directions there. Looking at our power demand and generation through the year, and I don't actually, this top one is actually not demand, it's actually how much has been generated, but I guess I'm taking it that we generate as much as is demanded, and that's probably not exactly right. But anyhow, this is, as we look through the year from January through December, this is the year 2021 up through August, and then we use the year 2020's numbers for this portion here. So we see this is where the total demand in the country is, and then we see these are the different renewable sources. This is the total renewable generation, and then all the different sources that make up that total renewable generation. So some takeaways is that our demand changes quite a bit depending on the season. A lot more power generation in the summer in this country, and also then in winter. In the summer, it's largely driven by air conditioning. In the wintertime, we also have a fair amount of electricity usage for heating of buildings, and we probably want to increase that even for reasons that Kevin Owens talked about. But we see, and then spring and fall, that dips quite a bit. We see a diversity of renewables that's fairly complementary. We see that wind is quite high in the spring, when hydro is pretty low. We see hydro declining through the summer, as does the wind. We see that the solar is highest in the middle of the winter. I'm sorry, the summer. And in fact, the solar peak almost coincides with the total demand summer peak as well. So that's a good thing. So if we increase solar, that's helpful there. But what would be really good is demand side management and electricity storage on a seasonal basis. That would be really great if we can, our excess power generation from renewables in the spring could be used to help us in the summertime. That would be a great thing. So some of those technologies are still, it's a nice discussion point, but it'll be interesting to talk to Carl about this coming up here in a bit. Moving to fossil fuels. Okay, we've mostly been focusing on the power generation or electricity generation sector. But here's kind of a, we got to be thinking about more than just electricity generation if we're going to be addressing climate change, because this is a chart. Let me just walk you through it real quick, showing the total amount of sources of energy that we use in our economy in the United States. So petroleum was a very large one, methane, natural gas, coal, renewable energy, and nuclear power. These different sources of energy go to either the electric power sector, where a lot of it, especially with the fossil fuels, is just lost to thermal energy losses. And this is what's the productive electricity usage that we can actually use in our buildings. And it goes to these end use sectors. So transportation is actually the biggest end user of energy. Industrial purposes, residential and commercial buildings. Now, both of these, that's probably primarily natural gas, methane gas going to them. Those buildings are using a lot of electricity as well. So if we got to get serious about, we got to get rid of all this in the next 30 years. So how are we going to do this? We got to have probably a combination of a lot more new renewable energy, but less total energy use. So that means there's going to be a lot of things besides just, substituting out renewable energy from fossil fuel sources. We got to be looking at making our communities much more walkable to reduce our carbon footprints. We also, I'm sorry, I'm going to breeze through this slide taken from another presentation, but just to illustrate the point that there are a lot of, this is a really big project we're on right now, and we got to be thinking in all kinds of different sectors and ways of doing that. And there are great opportunities for community organizing in all of these areas. I'm an architect, so I'm also thinking about embodied energy of our materials. So right now, building a new building, the biggest impact on the climate is actually the embodied energy of all these building materials rather than the operations of them. So that really suggests that retrofitting our existing buildings rather than building new is even more important than we thought. And also a lot of these existing buildings are located in walkable areas. They have big impacts in terms of what our options are with transportation as well. So taken from a presentation I gave to architecture students, what is the architect's sphere of influence when we're looking at that previous chart? And we can definitely have an impact as architects on or as community members who are organized and in terms of how walkable our community is. And so we affect how much transportation there is. We can also be reusing our existing buildings to reduce the amount of energy. And that gets to a lot of industrial energy is going to manufacturing building materials, and also all the concrete that goes into horizontal infrastructure, for all the cars and interchanges and things. So we can also be designing our buildings in such a way that they have much lower energy usage. So we're designing for reducing demand considerably. Things like super insulation that Kevin talked about, daylighting. Our buildings are mostly occupied in the daytime when there's daylight available, natural ventilation. And then making our buildings all electric as well. But we're going to go back and focus back on electricity generation. So dramatically reducing the energy intensity in our buildings and transportation sectors. So that means insulating and daylighting our buildings. That means mode shift in transportation systems, much more walking, biking, mass transit. it means that, there's certainly going to be some electrification in single occupant vehicles or automobiles, but that's not going to be the sole way that we get there. All of these things, though, are going to be increasing demand for renewable energy power generation and storage. If we're electrifying our buildings, that's going to be increasing our loads for need for generation. We're going to be moving off of using methane gas for space heating and for domestic hot water systems. And we're going to be electrifying our transportation systems. So it's all queuing us up here now to introduce our next speaker. So really excited that we're going to be joined today by Carl Borquist. Mr. Borquist has, yes, welcome. Has long-term experience in law, capital markets, finance, and renewable energy development. He is the CEO of Absaroka Energy and a sought-after presenter and thought leader on infrastructure development, grid innovation, and energy policy. Mr. Borquist previously served in the Navy as a judge advocate, as a special assistant U.S. attorney, and with the Davidson Companies as director of wealth management. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Public Administration from California State University and a law degree from the University of San Francisco. So welcome, Carl. Great to have you here with us.
Thank you. Ed, can you hear me okay?
I can, loud and clear.
Great. All right. Hello, everybody. First, let me say thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Northern Plains has been a group and an organization that I have respected and appreciated the past 15 years working in this sector. And I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you a little bit about this. I've got a very short slide presentation, but I really want to encourage everybody to ask questions. That's probably where you get the best mileage out of me rather than having me yak at you here. But I want to set the table with some slides I put together to try to address what my view of what I'm seeing in the energy sector, and particularly the renewable energy sector going on in specifically the Northwest, which is the area that we're working in. So with that, if you'll indulge me for a few minutes here, I will take you through some of the slides I wanted you to take a look at. If I can get the slide presentation to work. First slide here, first point. I think I've heard other speakers throughout the morning talk about this. We have a capacity deficit that's coming in the Northwest that's due in large part to the retirement of thermal, particularly coal plants around the Western Interconnect. Let me pause for a moment to say, which will become relevant in my comments, that electrically we exist basically west of the Rockies in a integrated system that is divided also. Let me go down to that slide for a second. I'll bounce around here. In other parts of the country, the transmission systems are organized in a region. Here in the wild, wild west, we have each utility running particular balancing areas. Those balancing areas are identified here, and it includes Alberta and British Columbia. This makes work in my world very difficult because when you're trying to introduce projects like Gordon Butte, that I'm going to speak about a little bit later, you're basically trying to work that project into all of these different balancing areas and different utilities. In other parts of the country where they're more regionalized, I can plug a project like Gordon Butte, this pump storage, into the system, and it can be accounted for and operated and provide impacts across that region. more difficult here, though we are starting, as some of you might know, to start to share in this energy imbalance market work that we're doing, which is basically kind of a half step to a regional transmission scenario. But it's important to remember, and again, I'm not an engineer or electrical engineer by training, so I have to dumb this stuff down for myself. Some of you probably know more about this than I do, but I like to think of the grid and the wires as a set of pipes. My lights and dryer and heating system is pulling electrons off the system. Power plants, solar panels, coal-fired plants are pushing electrons into the system. And that system has to be balanced every 4 seconds in order to keep it from blowing up. That becomes an incredibly important part of trying to make this transition from coal and nuclear and gas, in particular, to renewables, because as you all know, renewables, while they are clean and the fuel is free, they are variable, and that variability has to be controlled. I'm going to come back up to this slide for a moment. Our future will be more renewable. But we've got to account for the fact that a lot of this will be solar. And if you take a look at this slide, particularly the kind of Western states in 2050, as anticipated, you see a lot of solar in the middle of the day. That makes sense. We need some way to time shift that and to move that around. Storage, bulk storage is one of those things. Again, I'll get to Gordon Butte in a moment. But one of the interesting things that I am paying attention to in my role here at Absaroka is that it seems to me that the production of hydrogen, which is a clean fuel and can be used to put into fuel cells, will be a part of the storage scenario in the world that we're walking into. We have too much solar. We can use that solar in the middle of the day to produce hydrogen. I can use that solar in the middle of the day to push water in my pump storage to the upper reservoir so I can store it and bring it back out later in the day. And that sort of time shifting of energy, that impact of wind and solar in the system in terms of the way they trip on and off is very important. You've probably all, sorry, wrong direction. I'll get there. You've probably all heard about this infamous duck curve in California. And let me simplify this. What's happening in California right now is that solar is getting, the prices for energy and solar are going negative during the middle of the day. Some of that's being shut off because there's too much generation. And then at 3 o'clock, there's this whammy where the system operator, in California, it's the California Independent System Operator, has got to turn on things in order to make up that loss of generation and serve the load that's increasing through the middle of the afternoon and into the early evening. In California right now, that ramp, that duck curve is requiring about 15,000 megawatts plus or minus in order to make that adjustment. Now, 15,000 megawatts, that's like a city of 15 million people. The load in Montana, the average load, I think is around 1150, give or take, just to give you some perspective on a population with 1 million people. So it's a pretty dramatic problem that the utilities, balancing areas, and system operators are trying to deal with while they're integrating wind and solar into this transition. And it's something, if we're going to make this larger shift to renewables, that we have to take account of, we have to deal with in order to make that transition. Let me give you another perspective on this. I pulled up here in this slide a look at a wind profile. This is near Martinsdale, Montana. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see here where the wind farm is producing at its nameplate capacity. So let's imagine for a moment, it's a
You can
100
see your
megawatt
cursor.
wind farm. That wind farm is producing 100 megawatts at the top of this chart, and it's producing nothing at the bottom. And you can see how that's tripping on and off all the time. The wind turbines tend to kick in at a couple miles an hour and run the same speed. So you can't anticipate or understand that something different is happening, but that wind pressure and wind speed is producing different levels of electric production. And somewhere in the balancing area or in the system, some operator has to, every 4 seconds, make sure that the inflows and the outflows in that grid match. So a couple of years ago, I was sitting on a panel at a big hydro conference with one of the senior operators in California at the California Independent System Operator. And after our presentation, I had a cup of coffee with him. We were talking about what was happening in California. And he was seeing, again, this was a couple of years ago, I'm sure it's worse now. He was seeing 3,000 to 5,000 megawatt swings in his system within about 5 minutes. So let's think about that. That's like a city of 3 to 5 million people turning everything on or turning everything off. And that system operator has got to find something to counterbalance that. So again, as we start putting more renewables into the system, if we want the system to behave correctly and not blow up, we've got to make sure that we have resources that can juggle, time shift, that can do all of that. That was the purpose behind my wanting to have my little company work feverishly on this Gordon Butte project that I'll get to. But before I get there, just remember, as we're thinking about this, I put some images on this slide of an event that occurred in 2003 when there was a problem with a tree branch in a substation in Ohio. It tripped and cascaded into Toronto and New York and basically shut the grid off in those areas. That was a $6 billion event in 2003. I think about 40 people lost their lives attributable to that outage. So it's very serious stuff that we have to account for as we make this transition. Let me come back up. One of the other things that we need, one of the other challenges in all of this is we tend to have renewable resources oftentimes in areas where we don't have load. So we have to move that power. If we're going to make a grid supported by renewables, we're going to need some more transmission in order to move that power around the system. Here in Montana, we've got a very dramatic problem, which is the Colstrip line, which, as you know, starts in Colstrip, Montana, and heads west into Seattle and Portland, is not connected to anything on the east, north, or south sides of that system. So the line itself is very difficult to operate. It becomes very brittle because it's not interconnected into anything else. And this was part of what Texas went through in their problem this winter during that deep freeze. Is they didn't have, because they've isolated themselves electrically, they didn't have the ability to connect to other systems and other lines and try to juggle and counterbalance effects and impacts. Beyond that, if you think about it, Colstrip being a kind of a long generator lead line means that we lack access to other markets. Our market for selling power really is dependent on moving that power to Seattle and Portland via the Colstrip line going west only. And so development of other transmission allows us to tap into other markets as well as create a more reliable grid. All right, with that, I want to talk a little bit about Gordon Butte. I think a lot of you have heard about this project. This is a mock-up of the facility we intend to build near Martinsdale, Montana. We're taking advantage at this site of several very important features. One is in a very short distance, we're able to gain about 1,025 feet of elevation change. And that gravity opportunity provides the storage medium with water in a closed system. This is not connected to any other river or stream. These are two brand new reservoirs dug into the ground, lined. The lower one is filled with water. We have a powerhouse that you can see there at the back of the lower reservoir. That powerhouse is about a football field and a half and about 200 feet in the ground. Our plan for equipment, which has won some awards from the Department of Energy, includes independent motor pumps and independent turbine generators that will allow us to both pump water and generate at this very same time, and to move back and forth very quickly. This is kind of an overview of the project from the air. And one of the other very important parts of this location and this project is in about 5.5 miles on a single ranch, single landowner, we move from the project to the Colstrip system, and we interconnect at a point in the line where we join the networks of all the Colstrip utilities: Northwestern, Avista, Puget, Portland General, and Pacific Core. And that allows us to offer our services to those utilities to provide this kind of regulation and time shifting ability that I've been talking about. This slide, I want to take a minute to explain. What you're looking at here is 24 hours of behavior of a plant in Austria that is backstopping wind generation in Europe. Underneath, I've put that wind profile that you saw from the other slide, just so you can get the sense of how these things line up. The middle dark line is the difference between pumping and generating. So generating would be on the top half of this chart. Pumping would be on the bottom. And there's our 24 hours. And you can see how quickly this utility in Austria is moving this plant back and forth from pumping to generating in order to counterbalance and backstop the wind. And that is the kind of move and speed that we're going to need in order to have greater and greater wind penetration in the system, and still be able to make sure that the inflows and outflows match, so we don't end up with that lights out kind of New York City illustration that I put in the other slide. Gordon Butte will be probably and likely the starting point for some more wind development. There's an incredible wind resource in the Musselshell Valley next to our interconnection point. That substation that we're putting into the Colstrip system will be the only other substation in the line in Montana. So we have an opportunity to introduce power at Colstrip, at Broadview, at Loco Mountain, which is the Gordon Butte substation, and Garrison. But we've got a lot of great wind resource, over 50% capacity, just east and a little bit north of the pump storage project, including the original kind of utility scale project that we're all aware of at Judith Gap. Like I said before, in order to increase our ability to utilize renewables, these renewables tend to be in areas where we don't have load. That's where we can produce these electrons. We're going to need more transmission. One of the projects we're working on is a transmission line that would go from the Gordon Butte substation to Great Falls to hook into the back of the Maddle line. That would give us access to Alberta, give us the ability to move power back and forth from Canada into the Colstrip system, and at least for now, west. One of the other lines that we're working on, this is a kind of a suite of transmission that we started developing 5 or 6 years ago, includes a DC connection to Bismarck, which would tie us into another transmission system, and probably more importantly, taking the back of Colstrip down into Wyoming, Windstar, and Aeolus that would allow us to more easily move south and west, probably into California, and serve those markets, along with providing the ability to increase the capacity of the Colstrip system, because we're able to move power back and forth between east and west and north and south. I'm going to pause at this point because I'd love to take some questions from all of you and stop just lecturing at you.
Okay. Well, we got one question at this point that is submitted, and I encourage others to use the question and answer function because, yeah, Carl's got some maybe complex things that you may not understand. So some clarifying questions, we'd love to get those. We do have one question right now, which is maybe not quite to what you've talked about thus far, but I'll put it out there for you, Carl.
Bring it on.
Is one of the major reasons why renewables are more competitive now is because they seem to use more non-union labor? And a follow-up from the discussion regarding union support for Northwestern Energy, how is it possible to influence legislatures given the support Northwestern Energy gets from both Republicans and now Democrats of unions?
All right, let me talk about the unions first. Ed, I'm trying to look here to see if the questions are articulated. Oh, there they are. I got it. I see them. Okay, great. So first thing I want to say is I'm a kid that comes from a union family. Gordon Butte has had a long and important and respectful relationship with the AFL-CIO and the trades. There will probably be more construction jobs than can be filled by union labor in Montana, but we have a close relationship. That construction contract will first go to the unions to try to serve. And I think that's an important part of our story, an important part of what we're trying to do here. I don't see necessarily that for a job like this, that union labor is any more or less expensive than non-union labor. That's never been an issue, even for the big construction companies that we're negotiating with to build the project. So I'm going to walk the contract in to union labor and make sure that at least the unions have a chance to try to fill those jobs and be a part of that story. So again, to get back to this question, I don't think renewables are competitive because or not as a result of union labor. I think what's happening is prices have come down. One of the other speakers mentioned that. There's just more activity. There's more comfort with renewables compared to where we were maybe even 10 years ago. The technology has improved. We've got these incentives and motion to try to put renewables in the ground that's spurning creativity and innovation and competition. And so that is helping to drive this down. And we've got, in these cases, we don't have fuel costs, or we don't have the kind of cleanup and back end costs that you get in some of these other systems. Now, I will say, and I'm not trying to pick on batteries because I think batteries are going to be an important part of making this transition. But if we're going to use lithium at the levels and the extent that we're going to use lithium, we probably need to account for the fact that this is a radioactive fuel cell and we have to dispose of it in some fashion. These compounds and chemicals are going to become scarce and hard, and they come from places that we don't necessarily have great political connections to. So I'm myself, and I'm moving my company this way to think more about hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells. We're actually working here on a technology to turn garbage into hydrogen. That's, to me, the sort of holy grail of killing two birds with one stone. And I can answer some questions about that if anybody has any. But I think for us, we sort of think in 10 years, we're going to be doing less pump storage and probably working more in hydrogen and fuel cell storage as part of the storage scenario.
Another question, what companies and states would be interested in purchasing power from Gordon Butte?
Well, again, if you go back to what I mentioned before, one of the reasons why the location for Gordon Butte was so important was interconnecting that project into the Colstrip system, where we join the networks of all those kind of regional utilities. So Shazam, let's say I'm, Puget Sound Energy or Northwestern or any one of the Colstrip utilities. I think what I'm going to do with Gordon Butte is, one, I'm going to use Gordon Butte every 4 seconds to balance my system. I don't have the restrictions, either burning fuel or hitting minimum set points on gas, or the minimum flow restrictions on run of river hydro. This is a closed system. I can move it back and forth without any environmental impact, without burning fuel or creating emissions. I can do that every 4 seconds, and I can do it in a way that doesn't degrade the storage like it would with the battery, or creates any other problems. The equipment's very easy, and it's very easy on it to make those moves. So every 4 seconds, I'm doing something. But think about this. I'm probably in the middle of the day, what I would say, and what I was just talking about was regulating. I'm regulating on the pump side from about 11 o'clock till 3. And then at 3 o'clock, when the whole grid needs energy because of the solar drop off, I'm now switching to regulate and move up and down every 4 seconds on the generation side. So I'm generally pushing electrons out into the system. At night, when I've got lots of run of river hydro with nowhere to go, I've got wind blowing in the Columbia Gorge and no load to serve other than the pump storage, I'm probably pulling energy out of the Columbia Gorge and out of the hydro system to store energy while I'm regulating at night. And so that pump storage can serve a lot of masters at the same time, but it's basically tracking renewables and trying to balance them throughout the day.
Another question, you mentioned that the pumped hydro is a closed system, so you probably quickly answer this one, but where does the water come from for the Martinsdale project? In drought periods, how reliable is the water supply?
It's coming out of Cottonwood Creek. We have a water right that we get out of Cottonwood Creek. We lose about 5 to 10% of the total through evaporation every year, but it is a closed and lined system. So even this, by the way, we've been doing a lot of studies on this for the last 10 years. This year was one of the worst water years we've had in the state in 100 years. Usually in any given year, we can do the initial fill of the project in 30 days. We have a 50 CFS water right. We can do that in 30 days. We wouldn't have been able to do it this year to fill the entire thing, but our construction period is 4 years. So while we're building the project, we have 4 years to try to get the water into it while we're getting those reservoirs and powerhouses built. And then after that, it's just dealing with the evaporative loss.
Another question is, I've heard that there is a problem with wind turbines failing and blades breaking. How true is that claim?
In my experience, I've not seen a lot of that. I can't claim to be an expert in that, but I've just not had any experience with it myself. So that might be, it might be a little bit of a myth, but I also I'm not willing to be definitive about that just in order to be careful.
And I should also add it, and this is not a question, it was, some of us have seen you present before and are familiar with the Gordon Butte and how a pump storage project works, but we do have a lot of people on this webinar who probably would benefit from a bit more explanation of how the system works. But I'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, let me just jump in and say, that's a good point, Ed. So we will be connected to the grid. It's not that we'll be directly connected really to renewables. We get connected to the larger grid. And again, if you think the important way to think about this is to think of the grid like a set of pipes, and our job is to keep the pressure equalized. We've set up in our powerhouse these independent motor pumps and independent turbine generators so that we can pump and generate at the same time. And we can use that to quickly move from one to the other. And also it would allow more than one utility to be operating in the facility, and they might have different tasks moment to moment that they have to accomplish in order to deal with the particulars of their balancing area and their part of the grid. This project could produce 3,400 megawatt hours of storage a day. It takes about 10 hours to charge, and it can run for 8.5 hours at 400 plus megawatts.
Okay, good. Can you talk a bit more about how these transmission grid connections can create flexibility? Is our current grid capable of redirecting load in a flexible way, or would we need to update to more of a smart grid in order to have a flexible grid?
Yeah. 10 years ago, I used to hear a lot about the smart grid. There are a number of, I think there are a number of ideas about what the smart grid looks like. One of them is that we would utilize demand side management in order to create a time shift, not in generation, but a time shift in load. That is some low-hanging fruit, but given where we have to go, and if you look at the slides in my presentation, demand side management is by the experts, not me. I'm riffing slides off of others that have more expertise. Demand side management and that part of the grid being smart is a small part of the trying to get to a renewable future by 2050. There are to the extent that we have large loads that we can schedule, not your dryer, not your car, but larger loads, that becomes obviously more impactful and is smarter and has more capability of moving the needle. Again, one of the things we're working on is this processing of garbage with a plasma gasifier that has a pretty high electrical load that can be shut off in a few seconds. We will likely work with the utilities to offer that and the ability to shut that off as a demand side management tool. On the other hand, just generally, storage and fast and reliable storage is going to be what allows us to be flexible and move renewables around. Wires help us move renewables from the place they are generating, particularly the wind in Montana, to load so that we can serve those loads. And so wires become flexible and create flexibility in a big way. Storage creates flexibility, particularly fast storage that's not dependent on burning gas or run-of-river hydro, where we can operate it without a lot of environmental impacts, create some really positive flexibility.
The question about I'll read the question then. Considering the increased need for electricity in a renewable future, could you give us an idea of how much storage capacity will be needed and the feasibility of getting there based on current technology? Like how many Gordon Buttes do we need by certain dates or amount of renewable energy penetration?
That's a really good question. I'm going to try to give you a ballpark, but a lot of it would be particular to that balancing area or particular to the system as a whole. Are we a regional transmission system or are we, independent balancing areas? But think about this. The Northwest, as I showed you in the first slide, some estimate that we're going to need 10,000 megawatts of generation to meet that load by 2030. That's a lot. That's a lot of electrons. And let's say for a moment that we were going to serve the Northwest and that need of 10,000 with 5,000 megawatts of wind generation in Montana. That would require, at a 50% capacity factor, at least mathematically, that would require 10,000 megawatts of wind. Think about this. If you've ever seen Judith Gap, I think that's about maybe 130 megawatts of wind generation. So we're going to need a lot more wind turbines. Generally, I think of storage being at 30 or 35% of the generation fleet in order to create some sort of balance and scheduling ability for that generation. That's the first thing. The second thing that's important, and I'm thinking about what John said about maybe it was Kauai, which has got a lot of renewables. Some of this too is our ability to create diversity across generation platforms and across territory. So I'll give you an example of this. In Montana, the wind tends to blow very well during the day and very well in the winter. We have a dead spot in Montana for the wind in August, where it tends to slow down a lot. In the Columbia Gorge, that wind tends to blow at night, and it tends to blow better in the summer when the thermal layer is coming in and out of the Pacific, and that is moving weather in and out of the Columbia Gorge system, and those turbines are reacting to that. So part of this is looking at how you package different resources and how they're going to behave, and that helps you wring the most impact out of the assets that you have. Last point related to this, this is another reason why Gordon Butte is in an ideal situation for the Northwest, because there's one of the biggest transmission lines in the country is the Colstrip line. There is nothing coming east on the Colstrip line. There's no load to serve in Montana from the west. So one of the things I would like to do with Gordon Butte is see those Northwest utilities sending power at night back east on the Colstrip system, taking advantage of those wires by banking energy in Gordon Butte that can be brought out during the day. It's that kind of thing that allows us to really take advantage of. We don't want to put any more wires or turbines or infrastructure in the ground than we have to serve what we need. So we got to think intelligently about how we put those pieces together.
Looks like we've had a slew of really good questions come in, but we unfortunately have only time for one more question. And that question is, when can Gordon Butte become operational, and what are the obstacles holding it back?
Do you have a check? Gordon Butte needs to be, the capacity needs to be spoken for by the Northwest utilities. And we are submitting to RFPs. So far, we've not had any takers for the capacity, though by every expert's assessment, every one of those, well, maybe not Avista, but every one of the other Colstrip utilities has a rationale for utilizing it. I'm uncertain why, particularly given some of the cost savings that we've been able to achieve lately, why Northwestern is not jumping on this. I wish they would. It would be a point of pride for me as a Montanan to have Northwestern involved in that. I wish I could tell you why they're not. But I guess we're all looking at a scenario where a lot of the utilities seem to be attracted to non-renewable forms of producing electrons. And it's, we're all trying to figure out how to navigate that for the benefit of our kids and our world.
I wonder if Northwestern's lack of interest has something to do with owning reserves of methane gas. Something for us to
possible.
Well, thank you so much, Carl. We're going to have just a couple of minutes before our next presentation. Just going to take like a micro break, a 2-minute micro break. We're going to take a 10-minute break, actually. So yes.
Just let me say thank you everybody for listening, and I really appreciate the interest, and thank you for everybody that asked a question. That's really helpful to me as a presenter. So thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Thank you, Carl. Appreciate it. And we will see you then at 3:15. Very good.